I'd like to welcome everybody to this ADA presentation. And my name is Deborah Kissin, and I'm the co-chair of the Public Education Committee for ADAA. And ADAA stands for the Anxiety Depression Association of America, and we're so glad that you can join us for this wonderful webinar. I know I'm super excited to learn all the great things that we're going to learn. And I'm looking for the intro slide on this webinar. Oh, there we are. Okay. So the webinar today is going to be titled When Things Go Bump in Your Head, How to Master OCD with Unwanted Violent Thoughts. And our presenter today is Jon Hershfield. But before we get started in this webinar, I just want to spend a few moments introducing ADA and telling you a little bit about what ADA has to offer. ADA is the leading nonprofit organization in the field of anxiety and depression, and our mission is to improve diagnosis, promote the prevention and treatment and cure of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders through education, such as this wonderful webinar, and practice and research. And we work to end stigma and get the word out that these conditions are real, serious, and treatable. And I'd like to invite you to visit the ADA website, and it's really a great resource. All of the information is vetted and provides empirically supported information. There's so much information out there, but the key is finding good information that's going to help you move forward. And you'll find a great list of providers that offer empirically supported treatments such as CBT and related treatment protocols. So I recommend you turn to the therapist list for when you're looking to connect with a therapist. And there's also a free online support group that you can get resources at all times of the day to have people to help you push forward. And so I would also like you to consider making a donation to ADA so that we could put on more presentations such as this wonderful one that we're offering right now. And so let's get started with our current presentation. I'm happy to introduce our presenter, Jon Hershfield, MFT. He's the director of the OCD and Anxiety Center of Greater Baltimore in Maryland. He specializes in the treatment of OCD and is licensed in Maryland, Virginia, and California. And he's an author of When a Family Member Has OCD and Overcoming Harm OCD, and also all these great books that we have tons of copies in my office because my therapists really value them and my patients do as well. The co-author of the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD and Everyday Mindfulness for OCD. And he's a frequent presenter at the annual conferences for the International Foundation and the International OCD Foundation and the Anxiety Depression Association of America. So I'm going to now switch this over to Jon so he could share his material with us.
Okay. Thank you, Deborah, for that lovely introduction. Mm-hmm. And are you seeing the slides?
I am seeing the slides. I don't see you, but that's okay.
Okay.
I can our audience sees you. Do you see me?
Yes, I see both of us.
Okay, good. Then keep going because I'm sure everyone else can see you, and that's the important part. I'm going to play around. Yeah.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. Probably you'll see my eye line moving all over the slides, and I might move Deborah over so I could see her. And so I'm not looking any of you directly in the eye, I promise. Okay, so we're here to talk about harm OCD, which is one of my favorite subjects. Just before we start, I mean, the term harm OCD, I think it's worth mentioning that, we come up with these names for subcategories, different manifestations of OCD, and they're really just tools that we use for communicating how people experience OCD. It's not like it's a separate diagnosis of harm OCD. It's different diagnosis from, having sexual obsessions or something like that. And even within harm OCD, I've just sort of chosen to define it as being sort of exclusive to violent thoughts or violent intentions. But it's not technically true. I mean, someone else could say, well, I have harm OCD because I'm worried that I'm hurting somebody's feelings, for example. I don't think that's an invalid point of view either. It's another kind of harm. But just for the context of this talk and my book, I'm focusing more on specifically on violence or violent intentions. But of course, there's lots of different ways that we harm people.
Right. Question, John, because sometimes when people are Googling and trying to find information on what they're struggling with, so harm OCD is a classification to consider, this kind of OCD. How would you, in terms of intrusive thought OCD, or sometimes I hear clients saying pure OCD, are there other categories that when they're researching or trying to get information, it might fall under?
I mean, I think if you were Googling something like unwanted violent thoughts in OCD, you'd probably come across a lot of materials that say harm OCD.
Okay.
The term PRO is a bit, right. There's a lot of debate around it, obviously. Right. On the plus side, I think having a term for people who primarily do mental compulsions has been really right. useful for forming online communities, for sort of identifying oneself right. as like, I struggle with thoughts and I don't really need to tell you what they are. You just need to know it's PRO and I'm not watching and checking. It actually, I think, helps people to open up about what they're experiencing. On the downside, of course, the name itself is problematic because it sort of right. implies that you're not doing compulsions, right. but that's not really what it means. So right. I just always kind of tell people, some people wash their hands, some people wash their minds, many people do both. And that's really all we're talking about. Okay. So harm OCD. So let's start this thing, if I can get it. Oh, come on now. There we go. Okay. All right. So, there's lots of different ways to assess for OCD. In my practice, I just like to use the Y-box checklist and severity scale. What I like about it is that it's a long list of OCD symptoms. And so I can tell people, I'm going to rattle off this long list of symptoms. Maybe you have none of them. Maybe you have all of them. That doesn't really matter. The point is for me to just get a map in my head of where your mind tends to go, where your OCD tends to reside. So the first section of the Y-box asks about aggressive obsessions. And these are the questions that it asks. If you have an unwanted intrusive fear that you might harm yourself, fear that you might harm others, do you just get intrusive, violent, or horrific images? Because that's actually very common and can be kind of tricky for people who have them. And it's not so much that they're worried that something bad is going to happen. They just don't want to be thinking about, mangled bodies and car crashes and stuff like that. Fear of acting on unwanted impulses. What if I just stab the person next to me or push someone in front of a train? Fear of harming others because of not being careful enough. And this shares territory with what we sometimes call moral scrupulosity. Am I caring enough? Could something bad have happened because I didn't, check enough times or, set up some sort of safety barrier that somebody slipped through? And then fear of being responsible for something else terrible happening, like the house burning down because you left the coffee machine on or something like that. So this is, I kind of have this little meme here about, anything can be an obsession. And it's true, because what makes an obsession is not the content of the thought, but how you relate to it. We call them intrusive thoughts. So by definition, we're already establishing that we don't want them there. They're intruders. If I come in your window, I'm an intruder. If I come in your front door, I'm a guest. And
that's nice.
So it doesn't really matter what the thought is about. It has to do with, how you're experiencing the thought and then what you're doing in response to that experience.
That's nice. And for all viewers out there, our consumers, the Y-box that John just mentioned is a freely available tool. So it's sometimes a little tricky to implement on your own, but certainly not impossible. So feel free, you could access it and Google it, and it's available in a lot of ways to check out that Y-box assessment tool for OCD.
Yeah, and what I like about the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scales checklist specifically is that there are a lot of symptoms on it. It doesn't cover every symptom I've ever seen, but there's enough there that, it just changes the frame for, oh, I have this horrible thought that no one's ever had, when you see oh, okay, so these are all thoughts that people have. So that's useful. So I like to break harm OCD down into 4 categories. These categories aren't real in the sense that they're different diagnoses. They're just more like different emphases that people get stuck on. So fear of a harmful identity. What if I'm a bad person or a sort of closeted sociopath? Fear of harming others, fear of harming self, and fear of harming one's children. And typically these thoughts are what we call ego dystonic, meaning they don't line up with your preferred or assumed identity. It's strange to you that you're having the thought. You're thinking, why me? I wouldn't want these things to happen. I wouldn't choose to be spending a lot of time thinking about this. So that's what it means to be dystonic as opposed to syntonic. And again, we have to be flexible here because we also have ego-syntonic violent thoughts as part of being normal human beings. We get angry and we want to punch things. We were trying to get this webinar set up. We were both angry at the computer system.
That's what I was just thinking. I'm like, yes, we do have violent thoughts. My computer going out the window was, yes.
Right. So so what makes an obsession really is this quality of your disownership of it, not wanting to have it. And again, typically they don't serve a secondary function. You're not having these thoughts because you're hoping to hurt somebody or you're hoping to hurt yourself. And this is very scary. I mean, for somebody to open up about having intrusive violent thoughts with their therapist, absolutely part of the assessment process is we have to ask, you're saying you're having these intrusive thoughts about harming yourself, for example. How do you feel? We have to ask questions about suicidality, for example. And, to sort of distinguish, like, are these thoughts coming up because you're associating the violent thought with some kind of release or relief and it serves a function for you, or are they just sort of happening to you and you're afraid of them and you're trying to make them go away and that's making them worse? They often come with a lot of guilt and shame, obviously, like a lot of OCD, and they're likely to be under-disclosed. I often see clients who reveal their, unwanted violent thoughts to me long after I've been treating them for other sort of more acceptable OCD problems, and because they're afraid of being reported. And this is not some irrational fear, because someone who's not trained in treating OCD might say, what do you mean you're having violent thoughts? And they're writing the notes, you're having violent thoughts. And they might worry about mandated reporting laws and things like that. So again, it's so important if you have OCD and you're ready to take the leap of getting treatment that you are working with someone you have some reason to believe specializes or has a lot of experience in treating OCD. And lastly, typically these thoughts are not attributable to other conditions. I mean, it's part of what makes a diagnosis is we can't call it something else. It must be this. And there are some conditions that involve having violent thoughts and relating to them in a way that is different from OCD. And we want to be able to make those distinctions because we want to make sure we're giving them the right help.
And just to comment on what your wonderful slide, that often when somebody gets really knee deep into this kind of OCD, to know for sure if a therapist asks you, like, well, do you actually want to hurt yourself, or is it intrusive? When after spending enough time spinning around doing mental compulsions, it might feel confusing. Well, maybe I do want to hurt myself because this OCD is making me pretty depressed. But a trained OCD specialist is going to help. They're going to know the difference between true suicidal desires and how do I know for sure that maybe this isn't what it feels like to want to harm myself or to want to harm someone else. So sometimes those questions, when you try to do a self-assessment, that's the point. It's going to feel more confusing, but your therapist will know the difference.
And part of having OCD is also, struggling with doubt about everything. So it's not unusual to doubt your diagnosis.
Right.
And also mental health in general, we come up with these names for things. You have this disorder, you have that disorder. And what we really mean is that there's a spectrum of experiences. And and we're sort of all on that spectrum. And if you're off to one end of that spectrum where you're having a lot of these experiences and they seem to all fit in this category, we say, well, then you have this disorder. But it doesn't mean that if you don't have this disorder that you have no criteria that can be attributed to that disorder, right? Mm-hmm. I've never been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but I could certainly say I have felt unstable in relationships and frustrated to the point of being totally overwhelmed, which, you could say, well, that's a symptom of borderline personality disorder, because everybody's on a spectrum of everything. We start calling it a diagnosis when enough of the criteria are met and impairing. It's like, wait, this is the focus of our treatment. If we treat this, you're going to function better. And that's how that's what we should focus on. So we're saying, okay, so you have OCD, you have unwanted intrusive thoughts, you have compulsions for dealing with them. This is taking up a lot of your time and impairing your functioning. And whether or not you may also have kind of other issues that come with being a human being, we're not going to ignore them, but the focus of our treatment is on the OCD. And so having some concern about, well, what if this isn't OCD? That's okay. We're still going to treat the OCD.
And one other last point, when you're saying, when you see a provider and concerns about, oh no, if I share these intrusive thoughts, what if they take it to really mean I want to hurt my child, or really mean that I want to hurt myself? Bringing in, sometimes it's hard to find an OCD specialist, but if you bring in, Jon has a blog that's going to be associated with this webinar. I have a few blogs on the ADA website on harm OCD. So even providing it's hard to explain this, but there are really good tools out there that summarize this kind of condition. So bring that along with your appointment. I'm having this thought and it's feeling very much in line with this disorder, which I'm learning about, can help you. It's okay to educate your provider too. So no, that's perfectly acceptable to do something like that.
Absolutely, that helps a lot. It also helps with disclosure to parents, for example, who might be the ones, that you have to tell first in order to get the therapy. So, well, this is what I think I'm going through.
Right.
So why do we have violent thoughts? People have violent thoughts. Lee Baer, in his wonderful book, Imp of the Mind, talks about 3 possible reasons why we have violent thoughts. But besides, personally, the obvious, which is just we have all thoughts. So one is evolutionary theory, that we sort of develop these violent thoughts because they're useful. They help us hunt and gather food and things like that, and protect our villages and whatnot. And then there's Freudian theory, which suggests that we have violent thoughts because of unresolved conflicts with our mother, with our parents, and unresolved sexual desires that kind of come out in violent thoughts. And then there's a book by Daniel Wegner called White Bears and I think White Bears and Other Unwanted Thoughts, I think is what it's called, which is just all about the science of thought suppression. When you try not to have a thought, you're much more likely to find that thought to be intrusive. When you welcome thoughts or bring thoughts in, they're much more slippery. They kind of go through you. So one of the reasons people kind of have these unwanted violent thoughts is they're having the thought for whatever reason, and then they're trying to push it away. And thoughts just don't work that way. I like to tell my clients, it's sort of, most thoughts are supposed to just kind of go in one ear and out the other. And if on its way between your ears, you put up a hand and stop it, it's just going to keep doing this until you give up.
I like that.
This is what compulsions really are. They're attempts to.
I like that.
Oh, please.
That's nice.
And compulsions really are. They're attempts to kind of push the thought out the same ear that it came in, and if you do that long enough, what happens is it builds up this pressure, and then when you give up, the thoughts kind of explode, and they're even more intense and more upsetting than if you just let them go in the first place.
Yeah.
So common compulsions. We were talking before about pure O and people thinking maybe I don't do compulsions, I just have the thought part of it. And it's just never true. It can't be true, because part of what mediates having an intrusive thought is responding to it in a way that keeps it being an intruder. Like I was saying before, it has to come in through the window, not the front door.
Right.
So I just, in the next few slides, just divided it into 3 categories. Of course, there's unlimited categories here, but the first category I put in was avoidance. So that's what you tend to see the most, or rather, you tend to not see it. It's part of the problem. People can kind of hide their symptoms. So, they won't watch certain movies, or they won't be around certain people. So the first thing you usually see, if it's a fear of harming someone else or harming a pet, would be avoiding that person or avoiding that pet. You see a lot of avoidance of objects that could be used for violence, knives, household cleaners, even one's own medication, sometimes locking it up and setting all these barriers to keep you from abusing it. Avoidance of locations where harm could occur, being at the edge of something is very nerve-wracking for someone with harm OCD. Or avoiding stores where they might sell guns or knives or something like that. I've certainly taken a lot of clients to sporting goods stores.
You're having intrusive thoughts or religious.
Yeah, absolutely.
So avoiding important areas of your life to not have the thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that's key too, is important areas of your life. I don't think that the cure, for so to speak, for OCD is to do a lot of things that you don't want to do that are totally out of line with your values just because they bother you. So, for example, a person who might have a fear of shooting someone, but really in their identity, they're just not a gun person and they don't like guns. I'm not going to make that person, or even encourage that person, to buy a gun or to hang out at gun stores, for the rest of their life. We might use it as part of the exposure, but the question is your avoidance of it interfering in your values? So if you're driving, an hour out of your way to avoid driving by a sporting goods store because you're afraid you're going to walk in and get a gun, That
Right.
hour of your life that you're never going to get back is interfering in your values. It's not about the gun, it's about your behavior. So we want to drive by that store and maybe walk into that store and do exposures there as well, but not because we're trying to turn you into a gun person. We're trying to turn you into a person who's free from your OCD. Avoidance of triggering media, of course, racing to turn the TV off. And again, I think this is one of those areas where it's like, you don't like horror movies, that's fine. Lots of people don't like, scary movies and violent movies and stuff like that. On the other hand, there's a lot of movies that have violence in them that are incredible works of art, where the acting is amazing and the cinematography is amazing, and you're cutting all of that out of your life because it might bring up an unwanted thought. Or you see this with the news a lot, where someone's avoiding watching the news, where in their heart, their value is they want to kind of stay in touch with their community and their world, but they're not allowing themselves to do that because they might hear something they don't like. And sometimes we even see just avoidance of emotional states themselves, especially anger, right? Or any kind of feeling of being out of control, because staying in control is what's, reassuring you that you wouldn't harm yourself or somebody else. Reassurance seeking, so basically, the problem with reassurance seeking, of course, is that your brain has already established that you're okay, and you're constantly telling it that it's okay, which is challenging the notion that you're okay. So the more reassurance, the more insecure you become.
Right.
I like to tell people, your brain has no idea you have OCD. It's totally at the mercy of what you do. It assumes that everything you do, you're doing for a good reason. So if you're avoiding something that you don't need to avoid, your brain's going to go, oh, that must be dangerous. Obviously, there's no other explanation. Your brain's not saying, oh, she's just doing that because of her OCD.
Right.
So you're sending the signal to the brain that there's a reason you're avoiding it, and it's a good reason. Same thing with thoughts, right? Just avoiding having the thoughts. You're sending that signal to your brain, like, okay, this thought about breakfast is not important, but this thought about, stabbing someone is, and we need to treat it differently. When in fact, we need to treat them both like thoughts. Sometimes you see a lot of online research, of course, that's, the internet is a tricky thing for people. There's a lot of good things that come from it, and with OCD, it can be complicated. So looking up, people who've committed violent acts, researching serial killers, researching, how do I know if I would hurt myself or somebody else, and things like that. That can be a source of reassurance that backfires. Asking others.
Oh, I was going to say mental reviewing to see, did I do that? Did I actually harm that person? Or
yeah, so that would say, I would call that self-reassuring. Yeah.
Okay, you put that under self-reassuring.
Yeah. And I think in the next slide, I talk more about mental rituals. Yeah. And then checking and testing is another kind of reassurance, to see if harm was done. I've seen people scan their bodies for cuts to make sure they haven't already harmed themselves, or asking their partner, did I do anything to you? Or just like checking to see if the person near them is uncomfortable.
Right.
Or you might get an intrusive thought of harming someone on the street, and then walk around the corner to make sure they're still there, that you didn't push them in front of a truck or something like that. So yeah, so mental rituals. So the first thing that comes up for me when I think about mental rituals and harm OCD is reviewing one's intentions. This is especially for the fear of harboring a violent identity. This is such a trap, because you could never know what your intentions were. It's just literally impossible. You might have a guess as to what your intentions are in this exact present moment, but 5 seconds later, you're completely at the mercy of your memory, which is just more thoughts. And so getting in this debate of, did I want to cause harm? When my hand moved towards the weapon, was that because I was going to grab it? So you get lost in these webs. Right. Sometimes it's more kind of obvious, like just replacing a bad thought with a good one, right? So you have this intrusive thought, stab, and you try to replace it with the thought, help or something like that. And this is just a mental ritual that, again, it's establishing for your brain that there's something about this thought that can't be tolerated, that you shouldn't be open to, that is going to harm you unless you do the right compulsion in the right way at the right time. Playing out fearful scenarios to review how you would handle them. So, if maybe you're alone in an elevator with somebody and you start thinking, what if I suddenly decided to just, reach out and strangle that person? And then analyzing, how do I feel about that story? Did I like that story? Because if I liked it, it means I'm a terrible person, right? If I didn't like it, it means I'm never going to do it. And you get lost in the weeds there about what you would have or could have or might do. I think once the grammar gets complicated, you should recognize that it's a compulsion and step away. You mentioned people avoiding church because they don't want to, or they don't want to have, intrusive thoughts about their faith. So also you sometimes see compulsive and excessive prayer about, praying that I won't harm anyone or harm myself. Rationalizations is a very easy one to overlook because it just sounds so reasonable. I know I would never harm myself because I love my children. And you're saying that like 1,000 times a day. Right. And your brain is watching you do this, and it's thinking, man, she's really not sure. She really needs that reminder. So the rationalizations are tricky because unlike some compulsions where there's sort of obvious ploys, rationalizations seem totally reasonable. It has to do with using them in excess. That's the problem.
Right. I tell people round one is fine. Sometimes it's important to kind of psychoeducation for self, but once it becomes that repetitious process of you're kind of enter the compulsion area when you're kind of more stuck in a loop with it. So.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this in an upcoming slide. There's sort of a fine line between healthy rationalization, meaning taking a moment to look at a situation in a more rational way, and compulsive rationalization. And that's where cognitive therapy can be a double-edged sword. You have to use it. You have to know how to use it with this kind of OCD.
Right.
And lastly, superstitious rituals come up, that are sort of almost these kind of deal with the devil kind of rituals. If I move my phone over here, that means I'm not going to stab anyone today. They're not really related to the actual act, but they're the sort of superstition that the OCD is saying, well, if you don't move your phone to the left, maybe you want to hurt someone, and now I'm moving my phone to the left to kind of just to keep the OCD satisfied. You see these kind of very ritualized compulsions sometimes. Oh, good. So it's the next slide. So so cognitive therapy. I mean, we do CBT, and I get why people say tiny C, big B. It's true. Most of the work we do is behavioral therapy, but I do think that there's room for understanding two basic facts. One is that you're thinking. Right? This is a mindfulness lesson. You're thinking. You eat, you sleep, you walk, you think. Thinking is a thing that you do. And sometimes you don't know that you're thinking. And to be able to step back and say, oh, I'm thinking, that's a huge asset. That's, you're not identifying with the thinking. You're seeing it as a thing that's happening. Now we can take this step further and say, okay, there's a tone or a style to my thinking that is in this moment making me feel like I don't have a choice but to do my compulsions. And we always want you to know that compulsions are a choice. They're not an easy choice, but of course it's a choice.
Right.
So how do we get choice back into the equation? Well, one way we can do that is recognize how we came to the conclusion that we didn't have a choice. And that's a thinking style, which is really what a cognitive distortion is. It's a thinking style that leads you to the conclusion that you have to do your compulsions. And if you can just recognize that style, you can step back and go, okay, so what's actually going on here? The danger is getting into mental rituals now, right? Excessive rationalization, probability analysis. You should never use cognitive therapy to convince yourself that the math is the reason why you're not going to smother your baby in the middle of the night. That statistically you're not going to do it. What I recommend is using cognitive therapy to just become a better observer of how you think, and then ask yourself if this is a useful way of thinking, or if this is a familiar way of thinking that you kind of always know it ends in compulsions. Oh, okay, so I'm catastrophizing. This is a thing I do. I'm telling myself that something bad is going to happen in the future and I can't cope with it. Well, I'm not a psychic. Now, we're not saying the bad thing's not going to happen. We're just saying we're not a psychic. So the uncertainty is still out there. The question is, because I've now recognized that I'm catastrophizing, what do I want to do? Do I want to respond to it like that's a useful way of thinking and do my compulsions? Or do I want to respond to it like it's probably some OCD trickery and maybe take the risk of doing exposure instead? We don't have to go through all of these. I mean, some of these are probably very familiar. I do think the last one's worth mentioning, which is thought-action fusion, which is this kind of confusion that we get between having a thought and it producing some kind of outcome because we had the thought. And there's two types. There's the probability type, which is the more I think this thought, the more likely it is to happen. That's the fear. Like, oh, I've had 1,000 harm thoughts today, and that means I'm more likely to harm someone. When I only had 10 thoughts about watching TV. So, comparing the two, we get into that sort of mess. And then the morality type, which is the having of the thought itself is the problem. Yeah, what does it say about me? I'm less of a person. Better people don't have these thoughts.
Right.
And if I'm having a lot of them, I'm even worse of a person. And this is just a trick of the lights. This is the OCD basically saying, I got you, and the question is, can you recognize that illusion? Can you see that sleight of hand and step back and say, okay, this is me confusing how much or what kind of thoughts I have with what's happening outside of my head. Do I know what's going to happen? No. But does that mean I have to do my compulsions? Also no.
What I like to tell clients is at the end of the day, it's a safe bet if you're having an OCD moment and you're thinking, you're engaging in a compulsion. Like if you're not trying to solve a real life problem, like what do I want to order on the menu, or do I want to walk this way or this way? And you're thinking in an OCD moment, if it's hard to recognize, you can't decide, chances are you're probably engaging in some kind of mental compulsion of trying to get yourself out of the OCD moment, because there's rarely helpful thinking that is happening in that moment, and it's much more likely that it's some kind of mental compulsion that you're engaging in.
Yeah, I think it's also true in general, which is like even really, really important things that we have to address, we tend not to be this anxious about them because they're clear. It's like, oh, the plane is crashing. Okay, I guess I'll put my seatbelt on. We just kind of snap to. I mean, people with OCD are notorious for being great in a crisis because there's not all this, mental chaos. And so that's not a bad skill to be able to recognize the tone, the quality of mind, the chaotic quality, and say, I can't explain specifically how it's compulsive. I just know that probably, but what I'm doing right now is not in my best interest, and I should do a different thing.
Right. I'm not in effective problem-solving mode. There's just a chaotic, swimming, circular feeling to it, and I'm going to apply the different skills that you're going to talk about to disengage.
So the meat and potatoes of our work is the behavioral therapy, and again, we don't want to use cognitive therapy to make it okay to do exposure therapy. We want to use cognitive therapy to just enhance the ability to recognize what the mind is doing and to stay with the uncomfortable uncertainties. And what is exposure therapy? It's basically getting out in front of the trigger. It's beating the OCD at its own game. We want to put ourselves in the situation where the fear is very present in the forefront of the mind. We want to maximize the awareness so that we're staying with it as opposed to suppressing it or pushing it down. And we want to allow this urge to do compulsions to arise. I mean, really, if the end game is to resist compulsions, then we have to practice giving ourselves reasons to do compulsions and then not do them so that we get really good at that. So we do these exposures that bring up this urge, and then we watch that urge and we stay with it. And so instead of resisting or neutralizing the experience, we're changing our relationship to the experience. We're teaching the brain, A, I can have this thought. B, I can have the feelings that come with this thought and the sensations that come with this thought. And C, I can still stay committed to the present moment and live according to my values independently from all of that that's going on. And as I put in this slide, this is not inconsistent with mindfulness. When people say, oh, do you do ERP or do you do mindfulness? Like I want to do mindfulness, I don't want to do ERP, or I want to do ERP, I don't want to do mindfulness. And they're really one and the same. The primary difference is just how you're bringing about the experience. In exposure therapy, we're going to the experience and say, come here, we need the practice, let's get in the ring. And without that, if you were just using mindfulness, you would just be dealing with the experience as it arises in the present moment. You would still be doing all the same things. And frankly, mindfulness is terrifying because mindfulness means watching that thought, admitting that it's your thought, that it's in your head, and not getting into the whole identity debate about what it means. Watching what happens in the body, staying with it. You're doing all the same stuff. Maybe in exposure therapy, we're kind of pushing it a little bit further and trying to kind of intensify it in different ways. But ultimately, we're trying to get to the same place, which is acceptance of uncertainty, commitment to the present moment, and not spending your life distracted. You don't want to look back on your life and report on everything you paid attention to and realize it was just a bunch of thoughts.
And the comparison with mindfulness, it's kind of like a mindfulness exercise in a silent room with meditators in a perfect environment versus taking mindfulness on the road and you're with the kids and there's chaos and there's life, and how do you still return back to the moment and what's important to you? So
Right.
there are different ways to practice, and
Yes.
sometimes there are harder levels of practicing that exercise. So
Absolutely, which I think leads us into the next bit. Yeah. So mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment without judgment, right? Without trying to change the present moment. And really what it's about is training in the separation of stories from reality, right? The reality is there's only ever 6 things going on: your 5 senses and your thoughts. So if you can view that almost like, if you can picture being like a night guard at a security guard, and your job is to just observe and report what comes up on the monitors in the different rooms, and you have one monitor that's reporting on things that you taste or smell, and another monitor that's reporting on sensations in your body, and then there's this other monitor that tends to light up a lot in this population, which is thoughts, and stories, and to be able to sit back and watch them, be like, oh, okay, yeah, I see that I'm thinking this, or I see that I'm sensing that. That's what it is to be mindful. Meditation is simply practicing that. It's sort of sitting, like you were saying, in this kind of quiet space and saying, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this. And when I'm pulled away from that, I'm going to notice that I got pulled away, and I'm going to return my attention.
right.
And so you're practicing that. And then taking it out into the field is what exposure therapy is. You're right. It's sort of like, okay, now there's the kids crying and there's the noise and there's the music, right? So what are we talking about? Lots of sounds, lots of sensations, lots of thoughts.
Right. And the anchor in traditional meditation, people think of anchoring to focusing on the breath. And then in real life, you're returning your attention back to valued living and what is important to you, even with all the noises that are showing up. So
exactly. And another way to look about it, to look at it in terms of meditation is, I'm resting my attention here, either, on the breath in a meditation or on the present moment value in my regular life. And then the OCD is sort of capitalizing on my tendency to wander, because that's what minds do. They're supposed to wander. The problem is with OCD, we tend not to catch them wandering until too late. So we're not paying attention. So we don't notice that our mind has wandered. We think we're in the present, but really we spent the last 10 minutes thinking about, whether or not we're going to hurt someone. And then when we become aware, we go, oh no, what if I hurt someone? And at that point, we're sort of locked into a contract with the OCD. There's a condition to be met, and then you're allowed to return. That's what a compulsion is. It's like, well, just reassure yourself, or just convince yourself, or just remember, right, your therapist said you're probably not going to do this, or right, just look away from the thing that's triggering you.
Right.
And that releases you from the contract so that you can return to the present moment. And what we want to do is actually train in recognizing when we've wandered off and right, returning without precondition, just right, violating the contract, which is super right, scary. So, oh, did I wander off? Oh, am I going to stab someone today? Oh, that's nice. And then go back to what you were doing.
Right.
Yeah. And again, so this is just one way that you can enhance that skill, is having a regular meditation practice. It's not the only way, but it is one sort of concrete way of doing that.
That's really nice. Yeah, that's a nice way that you just bypass. You don't have to pay the toll of the compulsion to return back. You just return back. It's a contract that's rigged, and you don't need to keep that obligation.
Exactly. And both in mindfulness and in ERP, what you're really doing is you're teaching the brain what it's capable of. The brain is a victim here. The brain is totally at the mercy of what you tell it can do. So if you tell it that it's not capable of being in the presence of a thought without doing compulsion, it's going to take your word for it. But if you demonstrate that it is capable of being with the thought and not doing compulsion, well, might take a little while, but it'll pick up on the idea, like, oh, we can accept uncertainty. Oh, we can feel this way and not flee from ourselves. We don't have to like it, but we're capable of doing it.
Right. And for audience members who are listening to this, because I'm sure it all sounds great, because it all sounds great to me, but it's just super duper hard. So if it feels like, okay, I cannot give in to the compulsion, so why don't I? It's because every cell in your body feels that it should, and that's the right thing for survival. So just because you're going to be able to do this doesn't mean it's easy. It's possible with hard work that Jon's going to talk about. But if you're not able to do it yet, it's because it takes lots of reps and it's hard work.
Yeah. And you've been conditioned to not do it. You've been conditioned to both believe you can't do it and to find doing it unbearable. And reconditioning of any kind is always uncomfortable. Even the simplest thing, if you're conditioned to play one musical instrument and you're not some prodigy and you pick up some other musical instrument, you're going to play it badly, and because you're conditioned to operating it differently. They're like trying to write with a hand that you're not used to writing with. It doesn't mean you can't be reconditioned, but it's always going to be uncomfortable to recondition. So talking about exposure therapy, I love this slide because I didn't ask for these icons. The PowerPoint gives you design recommendations.
So funny.
And so the slide just said in vivo, imaginal, and interoceptive, and I guess somehow the computer decided that meant we're going to expose you to rats. You're going to have to sniff glue, and then we're going to put you in an igloo.
It's something very adorable about it. I love it.
Yeah. So what are we talking about here? So in vivo exposures would be directly interacting with the things that bring on your OCD. And we use lots of tools. We were talking about this before about things. I have a couple here. I have my trusty knife, which I do all kinds of knife work. My little fake gun, which is amazing because it shoots these little green pellets, and it has it's such a little toy, but even just sitting with the feel of it and having those emotions come up of,
right.
Did I like holding the gun? Did I like that feel?
Right.
And learning to just be an observer of that.
Yeah.
And this one's my favorite. I actually haven't gotten to use it with a client yet, but this was a gift for someone who made the mistake of thinking I was handy, and I'm not. So it just sits here in my office, but it's a hammer, pliers, and knife. It's basically like a harm OCD camping kit or something. Yeah. It's every weapon you could want. All it needs is something to shoot projectiles.
Yeah.
So that's in vivo. A lot of being around the things that trigger you. You could also say in vivo exposure would be if you're afraid of jumping, for example, going to a high floor of a hotel or roof of your building or something like that.
Or standing on the ledge of a window and, oh no, would I just pull it open and just jump out? So
right. And remember that as you know, the goal is not to stand there and convince yourself that you wouldn't do that.
Right.
The goal is to stand there and be in the presence of the idea that you could do that.
Right.
And ask yourself, what does that feel like? What does that feel like to be in the presence of I might? And training the brain that, okay, so I might is one of the objects of attention we can roll with, as opposed to no, that one's not okay, we have to change it. Imaginal exposures are great for harm OCD because there are a lot of elements of obsessions in harm OCD that you can't really do in vivo, or you can't take it far enough in vivo without violating ethics or harming people. So we're talking mostly about scripting here. So this would be writing narratives in which you describe your fears coming true, and then again sitting with, well, what does that feel like to think that it could come true? And then lastly, interoceptive, which would be trying to recreate the body sensations that you associate with your fears coming true. It might be getting yourself fired up to get angry, or it could just be, you associate it with having a high heart rate. So jogging in place before doing some ERP might maximize the exposure. So with scripting, I like to do two different kinds of scripts. One is kind of a starter script that sort of helps people organize their thoughts. It's sort of like a daily affirmation, but parts of it aren't so pretty. I have them ask, 4 questions. What am I going to change? And that basically just means, what compulsions am I going to stop doing, or what exposures am I going to start doing? Right? I'm going to stop hiding all the knives in the kitchen, and I'm going to let them be out on display. And I'm going to stop asking my partner for reassurance that I would never hurt him or her. Right? These are things you would put in this section of the script. And it doesn't mean you're going to do all those today on your first day of therapy. It just means sort of, now that I understand what OCD is and how it's treated, here's the plan. And then the second question is, what might happen as a result of you making these changes? We want to understand that these are not easy changes to make because you're afraid that something bad will happen. What is this uncertainty that you're exposing to? Well, I might spontaneously decide to take one of those knives and stab my partner and I guess, I don't know, go to jail or hate myself forever or whatever it is, right? And we're just admitting that, okay, OCD, you said maybe something, and pretty much everything that follows the word maybe is technically true. I always tell my clients, maybe the ceiling's going to fall on our head in the middle of the session. And that's an objectively true statement. It would be weird to put a lot of attention on it right now, And it's not an obsession, so I'm okay with that uncertainty. I'm not okay with it falling. I'm just okay with not knowing. And so when we sort of admit to the OCD, like, okay, all right, fine. So maybe I will do something bad. That doesn't suddenly mean, yeah, I'm going to spend the rest of my life on this 50-50 tightrope. It just means I'm not going to argue that point.
Right.
I'm just saying I'm going to make these changes. And maybe because I made these changes, the things I'm afraid of will come true. And then the next question is, okay, but what can I reasonably expect to happen if I don't make these changes, right? The OCD says jump, I say how high. What does that really look like? You know, imagine your OCD with the volume knob turned all the way up and you not putting up a fight. So you're not going to make these changes. You're going to continue to do compulsions, right? All the stuff that brought you into therapy in the first place. What does that look like? And what it often looks like is a kind of weird netherworld version of your fears coming true. You end up isolated. You end up not being able to function, not being able to have relationships. You end up thinking that you're harming people all the time, even though you're not. You end up doing all sorts of things, lying and manipulating to get your reassurance, and things that are outside of your values. And this is the very thing that you were trying to avoid. Sure, okay, nobody's going to get stabbed, but are you really all that much happier? So we're making the case.
Right. Well, like thinking about the core fear of, it does always come back to, it takes you to that place that, like you said, that you most fear going. So these kind of harm thoughts are always what you care about most. So what if I harm my child? What if it's not, what if I harm this magnet toy? Like, oh no, what if I throw this down on the floor? Like, who cares? But what if I throw my child on the floor? So by definition, the what if thought is going to relate to something so deeply important that it would be the worst thing in the world if something happened to it. So all those avoidance behaviors to make sure you don't do that. So, okay, I won't change my daughter's diaper. Okay, I won't be alone in the room with her. It will take you to the place where you have lost very important moments with that which you care the most about. So exactly what you said, that by engaging in the compulsions will get you to that very place you fear.
Exactly. What is that kid's life going to look like without a parent who can be in the same room with them? And how fundamentally different is that from a parent who harmed them? Right. And we want to write this in a tone that's basically making the case that to let OCD run the show for the rest of your life is just unacceptable, right? It's facing your fears is really scary. We just established that, it's opening up to uncertainty, that the worst thing you can imagine to the thing you care the most about is it's just awful that we're designed to have to put up with that, but it's just the truth. But we have to find it totally unacceptable to continue living this way if we're going to do this hard work. And that leads to the fourth question, which is, why is it worth it? Who am I? What kind of person, what kind of dad do I want to be, such that if I keep doing these compulsions, I don't get to be that dad. I can't have it both ways, right? If I'm going to be the dad that teaches my kid baseball, I have to also be the dad that has thoughts about beating my kid with a baseball bat. That's just reality. And maybe I can learn how to be okay with that. Maybe I can learn that I can have those thoughts, and even when they scare me, I can still be the same dad who's just having a thought and is scared. So those are the kind of, I call them acceptance and motivation scripts. They're kind of, designed not to habituate to, not to read until you're bored with them, but to kind of just almost like point you in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Then there's this other kind of script that's more ERP focused, sometimes called flooding scripts. And there's lots of different ways you can do them. And just personally, I think it depends on the client and their personality and how they process information. I don't think there's a one size fit all manual, like here's how everybody has to do scripts. And so I just give a couple of examples here of different ways that scripts could be written. So may, might, could stories. I might do this and it could lead to that, and then I'm in jail and it could look like this, and then this bad thing could happen to me. So you're telling a story about something that could happen. And for other people, writing a story about it will happen is more triggering. The downside to writing like I'm going to do this and this bad thing will happen is that some part of you probably understands that involves knowing something you couldn't possibly know about the future. On the other hand, the language might be so scary that it gives us more of that internal experience to expose to that it's worth it. So again, a lot of this depends on personality. And I also like screenplay style scripts where they're just written in the present moment. I walk into my daughter's room, I grab the pillow, I put it over her head. So you're kind of picturing yourself there, putting yourself there. And again, in the end, it doesn't matter as long as the goal is to generate the urge to do compulsions and be a witness of the not doing of compulsions.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to very briefly go over this because I just think it's so cool. So inhibitory learning, right, is a concept of learning that we're thinking about when we're doing exposure therapy. And in short, what we're basically saying is we want to, in this reconditioning process, not focus so much on making the thoughts go away or making the feelings go away, but focus more on what we've been saying this whole time, on kind of establishing that we can be in the presence of them and inhibiting ourselves from having to flee them, from having to run from them or shut them down. So exposures that maximize that are going to help you to get better and stay better in the long run. And this is just a kind of way to think about, how do I know if I'm doing exposure in a good way? Jonathan Bromwitz wrote this great little article in the IOCDF newsletter not too long ago, where he broke it down into anxiety tolerance, disconfirming expectations, surprise, combining fear cues, and variety. Mm-hmm. And I just further broken that down into a mnemonic because people who write self-help books start to think in mnemonics all day. And so always do something courageous and vulnerable. That's your ADSCV.
Can you say ADSCAV? It's not that catchy, like, as a word.
Yeah.
But always do something courageous and vulnerable. Always do something courageous and vulnerable. Like it.
Right. So we're working with anxiety tolerance or distress tolerance, being open to the experience, not, okay, I got to do this until I stop having this feeling and then I can move on. Disconfirming expectations. So we're not going to the exposure saying, I'm probably not going to jump. We're going into the exposure saying, I don't know what's going to happen and I'm willing to feel these feelings. And then being, pleased by the results when we find out, oh, I really expected it to go this way. I didn't think I'd be able to sit here and hold a knife. I just assumed I'd have a panic attack, and here I am. So that's cool. I've disconfirmed that expectation that something bad's going to happen. I haven't proven anything. Right. I think that we have to always make a distinction between proving that the bad thing won't happen and learning that you can be in the presence of uncertainty about the bad thing happening. That's the goal, is to do that learning.
Right.
And then surprise, right? The bigger the difference between the expectation and the result, the bigger the surprise. And that triggers something in the brain to say, oh, we should store this. This is useful. This is worth remembering, because we want to remember that we can do it. It's not good enough to just do it and then you come back to therapy the next week and you haven't, you can't draw on that skill anymore. Right. So the surprise helps. And I also like surprise in ERP where things slightly don't go your way, meaning maybe your anxiety is higher than you thought it would be. Or maybe in doing a knife exposure, you did accidentally scrape your skin a little bit or something like that. Or maybe you've been operating under this belief that people generally don't just kill themselves for no reason. And then you open up the news and there's some article that says famous person kills themselves, no reason known, right? Mm-hmm. And that's confirming your fear and your anxiety goes up. That's actually not a bad thing. Because one, it teaches you that it almost never happens, which is better than thinking it's about to happen and it just hasn't happened yet. And two, it teaches you that you can cope with that and you didn't think you could, right? It's going to depend on how you handle it. If you actually go back and do the work after that, and it's like, oh, so my assumption that things are always too hard is permeable. I can actually do something about that. And then combining fear cues. So we just want as much of the exposure as we can get. So that means doing the in vivo exposure of holding the fake gun or whatever, while also thinking about the script, I might shoot somebody, while also bringing in any kind of, body sensations that you can.
Right.
And then lastly, variety, right? Because who cares if you learn how to hold my toy gun? We want you to learn how to operate in the world. So just like with contamination, OCD, or a fear of germs, we wouldn't want to only do exposure to a doorknob. We would want to do exposure to things that are touched in different environments, in different places, under different contexts, in different moods, around different people. So the more you can mix it up, the more the brain goes, oh, I can handle it there, but I can't handle, oh, I guess I can handle it there too. And it starts to open up to generalize.
Right. And for the viewers from all over the world that come to learn and watch this great presentation, if there isn't someone in your area that can do this kind of or that is trained to do this kind of ERP. ADA has a list of providers that offer some web-based services, and if you have a well-intentioned provider and you bring a workbook, Jon has some great workbooks. The ADA website has OCD workbooks that they recommend, and the therapist has a workbook and you're working, you could get a lot done too. So just know that there are ways to work on this material, even if there isn't a local OCD expert to work with you. If you're ready to work hard and you have someone with you to work hard with you. Do you agree with that, Jon?
I totally do. In our line of work, we often consult with each other when there's a deficit in our knowledge. And I'm sure you've done this. I do this, with some regularity. I'll have sessions with non-OCD specialist therapists who want to better help their clients. I'm not exactly training them. They have all the training they need. There's just this one area that they haven't been exposed to because they don't treat a lot of OCD. And a good therapist wants to learn, right? And sometimes the best, thing to do when you're a non-specialist therapist, if you're already overworked and you don't have the time and you don't have the interest, is to try to find someone who can help, right? That referring out is totally appropriate. But sometimes you have the relationship with the client already, and you can help them, and you have helped them with a lot of things, and this is just one area that's not your area of expertise. So you can go get some training. You can get training from a book or consult with a specialist, or attend one of the courses from ADAA or IOCDF, and it can be done. Or we're here to help is the basically what we're saying. Okay, so before you get into all of this ERP, I think it's important to remember, because it's very scary, and a lot of people worry like, oh, therapist is going to make me do something I don't want to do, and we have to dispel that myth immediately. My job is to find out what the fear is and collaborate with the client on the best way to overcome that fear, manage that fear. And it's so important to me that they think they have a better understanding of it than I do, so that they're not just doing what I'm telling them to do, but that they're actually doing what they believe is going to work. And the best way for that to happen is if they allow there to be some guidelines. So for example, we wouldn't do unreasonable risk in exposure therapy. You gave the example of standing near a window or a ledge. I wouldn't do that on the top, on the roof of a building on a windy day with my eyes closed and my arms outstretched, right? And and we don't want to break religious or moral guidelines. We want those to stay intact, and we want to work with them. And no testing. This is the hard part, because you're going to do the exposure and be like, oh, good, I didn't, the bad thing didn't happen. And we want to be careful that we're not just using that exposure as a form of testing. These we can just plow through. I mean, they pretty much say the same thing. We have in vivo exposures that apply to harmful identity, scripting, interoceptive, and then you would just vary them based on what it is that you're afraid of. And are these slides available to download after the webinar?
Yes, and we'll have, with the webinar available, we'll also have the slides available as well. So
right, good.
We'll post those, Now these are
good. So just wrapping it up, some thoughts on how to respond to thoughts, right? The main rule here is don't be on the defense. If you're playing defense, you're already playing into the OCD. So these are just 4 ways that I think you can do that. One is kind of obvious. I mean, we always kind of forget that we don't have to pay close attention to everything that goes bump in our heads. We ignore stuff all the time. We have tens of thousands of thoughts every day. We do ignore most of them. We're making an exception for these thoughts. So ignoring is okay. It's not perfect, because if you're always trying to ignore your thoughts, then eventually that just becomes avoidance. But it's just one of the things you can do. Taking it a little further would be a more mindful approach, which is acknowledging but not responding. Like, oh yeah, that's one of my stabby thoughts. Yeah, I have them all day. And then you go back to what you're doing before you got distracted. The same way you would relate to a thought that came up while you were meditating. Then there's, of course, agreeing with uncertainty. Oh yeah, maybe that will happen. Yeah, maybe I will hurt someone or jump or do whatever. Okay, anything's possible. Maybe, maybe not, and then back to what you're doing. And then lastly, agreeing affirmatively, which is just saying like, yeah, you got me, OCD. It's going to happen today. Today's the day. Pick up, it's hammer time. Let's go. you know, and I think you should do that with a kind of, it's okay to do that with a sense of sarcasm or humor.
Right.
I mean, to bring flippancy into the equation actually is a great act of defiance against the OCD. Like you're
I'm here. I just want to, along with the responding to thoughts on the level 1 of ignoring, I keep this next to me, my blah, blah, blah pen. So,
right.
So kind of like, yeah. I put that in the first one of kind of ignoring, like.
Absolutely.
Okay.
You know, it's like having a friend that's always talks about politics. At some point, they just start to sound like the mom from Peanuts, and
Right.
that's okay. They can still be your friend, but that doesn't mean you have to take the bait every time they want to talk about the thing that they want to talk about.
But the difference between ignoring, like, okay, whatever, and ignoring, like, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Is
that's
very
paying a lot of attention, though. I mean, that's right. Doing this is not ignoring. Doing this is a big production, right?
Right.
So I think this is the last slide, just, you know, kind of 3 things that we include with ERP. We already talked a bit about mindfulness. So mindfulness skill training, I do think, is an important part of the work.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to do it in this specific way or this other specific way, but you want to bring it in there somehow, because at the end of the day, that's what we're still dealing with, is being distracted by unwanted thoughts, feeling like we have to do something to get back, and feeling like we don't have the skills. And mindfulness is one of those skills. Self-compassion work, it's important everywhere. It might be more important in harm OCD than anywhere else. I don't know, but the ability to push you into self-critique and self-judgment so that the only thing you can think of is how to soothe yourself is a big reason why you do compulsions, right? If you've beaten yourself down so the only thing you can do is figure out a way to feel better, that's a trap. And if you remove self-hostility from the equation, if your belief is that if the bad thing happens, I'll cope with it somehow, and you don't have to actually define what the word somehow means, there's very little for the OCD to actually grab onto. So I'll leave it at that. I mean, you know, the whole presentation on self-compassion, but it is an important feature here, and it's something we often overlook. And then, you know, bringing in your system, your family, your friends, the people in your system who might be giving you reassurance, might be accommodating your rituals, you know, teaching them about OCD and how it works, and how they can help you by actually helping you as opposed to enabling you is an important part of the equation as well. And I think that's it. Yep, these are, we did it.
All of the wonderful resources that, books that we highly recommend that can help on your journey, whether it's through self-work or working with a therapist or even having a friend who could serve as your coach. So there's so much more information that I would want to learn from Jon. So I'm hoping this is maybe just a part 1, and we'll have a part 2 sooner rather than later. So for now,
I like it.
Jon, thank you so much, and thank you, ADAA, for allowing this material to be disseminated to those who are viewing. And if anyone has any questions, you could email ADAA, and we'll get those questions back to Jon to be answered for future material. So
yeah.
Thank
you so much for inviting me, and thank you to ADAA for all the resources. It's a terrific organization.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. Okay. Turning off.